Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our latest Wellness by the Water Cooler. Today is going to be all about transitions. Darren Black is my name. I'm the CEO of SuperFriend, and I'll be hosting the webinar today. And before I introduce our extra special guests, I'm really excited about this one. It's going to be a terrific example of two organisations working together in collaboration for meaningful outcome and impact. Just let me kick off and begin the webinar today by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land we gather on today. We three are in Melbourne, on Wurundjeri land, on the Kulin Nation. I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, past, present and emerging. And let me also acknowledge those with lived or living experience of mental illness or mental ill health. For those of you who are joining us, feel free to pop in the chat wherever you are joining from today in this great land. A little bit about me as your host. I'm stepping in for Steph today. This is the 13th edition of our Wellness by the Water Cooler series. And as I said, today is all about transitions and how they impact us through at work and in life. I guess at a personal level, I've experienced several of these sort of key transitions in life. Growing up in a military family with dad in the Navy, we moved home frequently. And so there's frequent moves and there was frequent transitions from school to school. Then there's your first job. And, you know, for me, it was joining the military. Later on, raising young children, changing jobs, family illness and crisis. And I'm now at the point in life where I'm starting to care for aging parents. So I guess it's just reflective of the various transitions that we all experience through life. And today's conversation is really going to focus in on those transitions and how they relate to you, your workplace, and what we can do about it. The timing of today's webinar is really deliberate. We've just released a white paper developed in collaboration with the terrific team at Transitioning Well. The link to the white paper will be added to the chat towards the end of today's session, as well as a really neat infographic summary that provides detail that threads from the white paper. It'll be there for you later in the session. Just before I do the introductions, today's webinar will touch or may touch on some distressing topics potentially for some people. This is just a gentle reminder, I guess, to treat the space and each other with respect and compassion. And we do absolutely encourage people to share, and there'll be several moments during the webinar we will invite you to contribute to the chat, and there will be opportunity for questions. Just be a little bit cautious about the level of detail that you share in the chat. Be conscious of keeping this space safe. If anyone does feel any distress at all during the session today, please take the time to take care of yourself in whatever way feels appropriate for you. So if you need to pop out, take a break, or leave early, then feel totally free and able to do that. So it's my great pleasure now to introduce our two speakers, both experts in the field, Dr. Sarah Cotton from Transitioning Well and Dr. Dianne Shepphard. Sarah, first of all, is an endorsed organisational psychologist with a PhD in work stress, and Sarah's going to bring some of that eminent experience and research knowledge to us today. Sarah has over 20 years in coaching, training and consulting, and is very committed to reducing the costs of work-life conflict and supporting workplaces to navigate the challenges of modern-day work. In 2011, Sarah co-founded Transitioning Well, a company whose goal is to help individuals and workplaces to navigate life transitions at work so people can live and work well. So good to have you with us today, Sarah.
Good morning, Darren. It's great to open up this important conversation. Thank you for having me.
Dr Dianne Shepphard has been with us at SuperFriend for the last, I think it's 2.5 years now, Di, in the role of Senior Research Program Manager. Di moved across from Monash, Monash's University Accent Research Centre, where she worked as Senior Research Fellow for over 10 years. Di has over 20 years research experience working specifically in the area of work disability, building work capacity and facilitating return to work, as well as identifying and addressing psychosocial barriers to achieving positive health and work outcomes. Welcome to the lovely Di. We love having you at SuperFriend, and Di is one of the co-authors of the white paper that I mentioned earlier. So they're our terrific speakers today. I'll simply be facilitating and asking Di and Sarah a series of questions which we hope will really inform you. In context, today's webinar is really about work-life transitions, why they matter, what the data insights from the white paper revealed, and what employers can do to manage the impact of these and be more proactive. There'll be 3 themes that will guide you through. The first is around defining what transitions are. Secondly, identifying common patterns and potential blind spots, particularly from an organisational leadership and policy perspective. And finally, and probably most importantly for our audience, is looking at what we can do in actuality and what good looks like, and some really great examples that you'll be able to take away and think about that from your own organisational perspective. So without further ado, let's kick it off. And I want to go to that first theme, and what is a transition? How does it differ from just various change of events that affect us in life? And what are the impacts of transition? Sarah, I'm gonna go to you and call upon your eminent experience to talk us through that.
No worries. It's a great question, isn't it, to start the conversation this morning? I think, Darren, having worked in transition for some time now, I think it's so important, isn't it, to just tease out, what do we actually mean by transition? I think sometimes there can be such a confusion between change and transition. They sort of tend to get lumped together into the same bucket. So I guess I want to start us off, Darren, by actually disentangling that a bit and going, what is the difference between change and transition? So a change is sort of what happens to us, if you like, an event that might be like, having a baby, moving house, like your experience was, Darren, as a kid many times, or, getting that promotion. Whereas a transition, if you like, I always think of it like the heart of change. It's the transition that people go through, sort of that internal psychological transition to navigate from what was known to actually navigating to the new normal. And what we know, sort of from a mental health and wellbeing perspective, is that middle zone, if you like, that transition zone can be pretty tricky. It can be pretty challenging for people. And the other piece I just wanted to tease out too, Darren, because I get this question asked a lot to me, is, Sarah, how can one transition have a bigger impact on me than another, like even a positive one? How come, this, I don't know, a transition to becoming a mum has had such a big impact on me when I wanted to be a mum for so long? It's been a really positive transition. I planned for it, et cetera, et cetera. Like, why is that still so tricky for me? And I just want to draw on the work of Professor Nancy Slosberg, if I may, because I hope this is helpful for your audience, because what Professor Slosberg really helped me to understand is, in order to understand the significance of a transition, there's 4 things that you want to understand. One is like, is it changing my role?
Yeah.
Is it changing my relationships? Is it changing like the routines and rhythms that I have every day? And is it changing like the assumptions that I hold? And if I can give a really practical example of that, Darren, let's take COVID-19. I think something that we all relate to, right? Did that change our roles? Absolutely. For many of us, we were parents, we were workers, we were having to do homeschooling, there were all these changes to our roles. Our relationships changed, our routines changed, and the way we saw the world, the assumptions that we held changed. So I hope that's helpful for the audience, Darren, to separate out change and transition and to think about why some are so significant and why some do actually impact our mental health and well-being more than others.
Thanks, Sarah. Look, I mean, what I loved there was that giving us that context of change is what happens to us. It's the event, whereas the transition is the process we go through to adapt to the kind of, the new normality. And how we deal with it is that sort of challenging place in the middle. I think that's a lovely way of framing it. And hopefully it's helpful for people too to think about it in that sort of framework that you've just provided, thinking about those 4 key areas of role. What's my role? How's that changed? Relationships, routines, and what are the assumptions behind that? So I think that's a lovely sort of context and framework to kind of set the scene for what these transitions are all about and why they can have and do have such an impact on people. Di, I'm going to go to you now, and from our perspective, from a research perspective, how do we sort of frame that, and what's important for people to pick up from that perspective?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Darren. And of course, anyone who's familiar with SuperFriend know that we're all about workplace mental health insights. And so we sample annually from the Australian workforce. And so from the SuperFriend data insights perspective, we're really interested in exploring how the demands associated with those life-work transitions can impact not only employee mental health and well-being, but also those work outcomes that are important to employers, including being productive at work, feeling engaged with your work, and also employer loyalty. And so we get these insights, of course, through our Indicators of a Thriving Workplace survey. And for this particular purpose, we sampled from 2 of our 4 waves from the 2024 data set. And we sampled over 6,000 workers nationally. So that just gives you the context.
Well, that's a fairly substantial sample size, Di, and I think it's reasonable that we can draw some conclusions from that. So I think we're going to pop up a slide here for the audience, and I'm going to throw a first question to our audience as that slide comes up. And it's going to show a list of some of the more common work-life transitions. And you can see there on that slide, it talks about, parenting with babies, young children, caring responsibilities, personal family crisis, job loss, unemployment, perimenopause, menopause, planning for retirement, etc. So there's some of the big ones that we know about. What we'd love to know from an audience perspective is what's your experience, and if you can pop into the chat one transition, try and pick one that you think is having the most impact or is most relevant in the context of your place, your workplace right now. And that may be tricky, but I think it'll become clear later as we work through this that the nature of the workplace, the nature of your environment, the demographics of your workforce are really critical in terms of understanding or anticipating what are the types of transitions that your people are likely to be experiencing. So as you're having a read through that, we'd love to have your input to try and pick, what's the one that you think is having the most significant impact right now. And I can see some of those coming into the chat now. So thank you very much. I'm going to go back to you to give a bit more context to what the data says in terms of, we've done the research. What's the data telling us about the impact of the various types of transitions across workforces nationally?
Yeah, great. Thank you, Darren. And I'm sorry, I'm sharing screen here, sharing the slides here, and I actually can't see the chat at the same time. So I'm not aware of what people are entering into the chat, but let's just flick through to what the data say. And so you should hopefully now see what our data insights have shown in terms of the most common life transitions that came through for the Australian workforce in 2024. And top of the list with 12.6% of the Australian workforce was planning for retirement. And following that, we have those experiencing personal family crises and then caring responsibilities other than parenting. Perimenopause and menopause also collectively together, it affects a considerable number or a considerable proportion of our population as well. And then there's job loss affecting the household and parenting. And so that's what the data say. And so, of course, we have, if you look at the figures as a whole, we have around 50% of our workforce being affected by at least one work-life transition. And, of course, some employees are experiencing more than one of these simultaneously.
And I can see feedback from some of our attendees, participants coming through the chat now, and people are picking up and sharing with us personal and family crisis, caring responsibilities, ageing parents, and the like. So it seems to be quite job transition, job loss. It seems to be quite consistent with what the data is telling us. So, Di, we're going to sort of transition now into theme 2, common patterns, and helping us to identify where there might be potential blind spots from a workplace perspective. So let's go to what is the impact of some of these transitions on people? And first of all, Di, what's the data tell us in terms of what the impact can be of these various transitions? We know they're really common. We know they're going to affect most people at different times of their life.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Darren. So, of course, as expected, the data do show that transitions affect both work and mental health outcomes of Australian workers. And I want to firstly turn to one of the most commonly used indicators that we at SuperFriend refer to, which is our psychological distress measure. It's a good indicator of worker mental health. And this slide shows the 3 top transitions in terms of the highest percentage of workers with moderate to severe levels of psychological distress. You can see that came through at nearly 80% for those who are parenting and for those who are experiencing personal family crises. And just below that, those who are experiencing a significant caring responsibility that does not include parenting. So I think these results are striking. And this was not only shown for psychological distress, we also showed that burnout is affected, absenteeism, poorer workability, and that's a self-rated measure, as well as presenteeism, and perhaps a little bit more subtle and difficult to detect for organisations, intentions to leave was also affected by these transitions. And so, of course, when we looked at the data that for employees who are experiencing multiple transitions, as expected, again, they showed poorer outcomes again, including elevated levels of burnout, higher presenteeism, and more severe psychological distress.
I'm just getting some feedback from the audience there that I think, did we have a slide that reflected the sort of top 3 or 4 there? I don't think it's coming up.
You can't see that? Okay, I'm going to try and rectify that right now. Sorry, everyone.
But conscious of what Di shared in terms of the data there, Sarah, I mean, what employees experiencing multiple transitions are likely to have poorer outcomes. I mean, is there any surprises there in the data from your perspective?
No, that cumulative stress that occurs with multiple transitions is really understandable, isn't it? The adaptation stress, that sense of overwhelm, the ability to cope can be really compromised when you're trying to juggle so much. But with this data now, and we can see that now, thanks so much for that, Di. So powerful, isn't it, to see the levels of psychological distress across those common 3 transitions. And it's always really reassuring, I think, when the data has such good face validity with what we see at the coalface in the work that we do every day in transition. That doesn't surprise me at all that these 3 have come out is at the highest level of distress. if you look at the parenting one, Darren, that transition from working person to working parent, we know that's a really, if not the most significant transition that people will go through in their life. And sort of from a mental health and wellbeing perspective, it's a time in one's life when they're most likely to develop a mental health concern for the first time, or actually have that triggered. 1 in 5 women, 1 in 10 men, for example, can experience perinatal depression. Many men don't even know that they can even experience that. So it's often really not spoken about. And then if you look at the data again, you look at family crisis, as the participants in the chat, there's so many people who have been touched by personal family crises. And, we all know the impact that can have on us, because they're often unexpected. And the sense of loss and grief that comes with some of those personal crises can be so disruptive for us in our lives. And then the third trend was the caring responsibilities. That doesn't surprise me either, Darren. We know at the moment so many people are carrying multiple caring responsibilities. There's been a lot of media attention recently about the sandwich generation. So people, who are caring for their kids, but also caring for their elderly parents. That elder care is becoming, more and more common in the aging demographic that we're seeing, internationally, not just in Australia. So I think, really good face validity on what the data is telling us. And I'm sure not surprising to the people listening in on this webinar either, Darren.
No, I'm sure it's not. And, from a personal perspective, I mean, it feels to me like I've only just transitioned from having, school-age children at home into a situation where, I'm now being needed to care for, aging parents. And so I guess we're not sort of necessarily prepared for these things, are we? And yet they happen. I mean, that's the event. The situation occurs, and then we've got to adapt and respond to it. I guess, for me, what's sort of strikingly clear there is that there'll be a range of events that we're exposed to through life, and perhaps the coincidence of 2 or more of those events at the same time is perhaps where we've got the area of most concern when it comes to the impact on mental health. And we might circle back to potentially how to prepare ourselves and prepare our workforces for those sorts of events. But Di, are there differences? Does the data bring out, are there differences in how transitions are experienced and sort of responded to by different employee groups? And, here, I guess, we cut the data, we look at age, we look at role, we look at gender. When we look at it through those different lenses, what's it telling us?
Yes, I think it's really important to consider that, Darren. And we did find that age and gender influence the experience of life transitions. So we have different proportions of males and females experiencing these life transitions for a start, and different worker generations, a different proportion of those worker generations experiencing the transitions. And of course, they're also differently impacted. And I'll just give one very brief example. So while we found that more females than males experience intense psychological distress when experiencing personal family crisis, male employees report taking more days leave due to stress than females for parenting and personal family crises. So different individuals are impacted differently. And our data also clearly show or demonstrate that not everyone experiencing a life transition or one of these transitions will be negatively impacted. So some are not impacted as much as others.
And I've seen some data recently, and in fact our own and independent research around the levels of psychological distress and burnout for younger workers. Yes. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And so, and that's one of the biggest things, or the strongest trends that we see, is that our younger worker generations are impacted more in terms of psychological distress and also to a certain degree burnout. So, yeah.
I sense that could be a major topic of interest. I'm so curious to ask more questions about the intergenerational factors here. if we've got time at the end, we might circle back to that. But I suspect that could be the topic of a whole other webinar, looking at those intergenerational factors. So I'll go back to you now, Sarah. Is there any other way we can, help us understand this from a sort of practical and experiential perspective?
Yeah, I thought it might be helpful to the audience to draw on Nancy Slosberg's work again here, because what her research really helps us to understand, Darren, is those differences that we see across how people sort of, I guess, cope with and sort of moderate these transitions. And she has this lovely model that goes, there's 4 things that we need to be thinking about, if you like, the 4 S's.
Yeah.
So what is the situation that the person's navigating? So, like you said, Darren, what's the timing? Is there multiple transitions going on? Are they juggling, a move and a new baby and a promotion all at the same time? So what's going on in that situation? What's going on for them themselves? So that's age, demographic, some of those characteristics that you've spoken about, Di. What are the supports that someone has at that time of transition? So that, do they have a sense of connection? Do they have someone that they can reach out to, or a community that can support them through this transition? And what are the strategies that they hold at that time? So in other words, what's in their toolbox? Do they have a transition toolbox of coping strategies that they can draw upon? And if we look at those 4 S's, the research and practice wisdom tells us that that's really it really helps us understand how someone is successfully or struggling through a transition, depending on how they're going in those 4 areas and what's going on for them. So I thought that just might be a helpful framework, Darren, because sometimes it can be quite cloudy to try and unpack all of these individual variables for someone. But I think those 4 S's, if you like, the 4 S's of transition success, is a really nice way to think about that from that perspective.
I think that's super helpful, Sarah. I mean, dealing with change and going through these transitions can be overwhelming, I guess, for people at different times. So I think having that framework that sort of goes to understanding the situation or the causality, the personal circumstances of self, what support structures and networks you've got around you or might need, and then the strategies for how to cope and deal with that. I mean, it sounds just like a really sensible, structured methodology on how to think about it. No, thank you. That's terrific. And I'm sure we're gonna have an opportunity to circle back to try and unpack that a little bit more. From a kind of personal scenario perspective. Hopefully, we can do that a little bit later. I want to go now to from a leadership and organisational leadership and policy perspective. Sarah, what are some of the most common assumptions leaders make about employees in transition, and what are some of the blind spots that we're missing?
Yeah, it's such a great question. I could talk all day about this one. So I've actually written down my top 5, if that's okay, if you can bear with me, because I didn't want to
We've taken the lid off. There's a deep reservoir of knowledge there, Sarah. Give us your top 5.
So much so, Darren, that we have this mantra at Transitioning Well, which is ask, don't assume. It's so important, isn't it, as leaders, that we actually ask, don't assume, because so many assumptions are made, Darren. And in fact, before I get to my top 5, I just want to call out, because it was such a one of those aha moments for me, in that sometimes what can happen is it's called benevolent bias. So we assume as a leader that we think we're being kind and we think we're protecting our worker and making assumptions that are not always correct. And I'll give you a good example. Let's just say a working parent who's come back from parental leave, and we make an assumption that, they're not going to want to travel, so I'm not actually going to ask them for that promotion, because I'm going to assume that they're not interested in travel because they want to be home with their baby. That's an example of benevolent bias. So we really want to be able to test out and ask, don't assume, because the top 5 that I see, and now I'm going to stick with my notes, otherwise I'll get on my high horse and I'll take too long. So the my number one assumption that we often see leaders making is that they think employees experience transition the same way. So same transition. This employee, A, B, C, D, are all going to experience that the same way. It's hugely variable. It's hugely individual. So we need to make sure that we test that assumption. There's also an assumption, Darren, that workplaces cannot effectively support these transitions. So an assumption that, oh, that's a life transition that needs to be supported and shouldered by the individual. The workplace can't really have impactful intervention. What we know wholeheartedly is that the workplaces provide such an incredible vehicle for early intervention. In fact, some research tells us that, supporting work-life transitions is a hidden gem. In some European countries, Darren, the work-life interface is identified as actually as a psychosocial hazard for that reason, because it's so important to support these, and workplaces can make a massive difference.
Yeah.
Keep going with my last three.
Keep going. You're on a roll. You're on a roll, Sarah.
Well,
and I'm going to circle back because there's a couple of these things I think are just brilliant. So.
Okay. So there's an assumption that leaders will know the signs to look out for. But as you said, Di, so often we miss the signs. And some of those more subtle signs can be things like presenteeism, disengagement, turnover. And I'll give you a really good example too, Darren, if I may. The working parent piece is sometimes we can see maybe someone's struggling, and we can see them struggling, but we might actually make the assumption, oh, they're just tired, they're just fatigued, they're going through parent stress. And we actually don't realize that it's actually turning into distress. And so sometimes we can make these assumptions so quickly through some of these transitions. Oh, they're just grieving, they're just this, they're just that. And we don't realize that there's actually a lot more going on for that person's mental health and well-being. The last two is we have an assumption that people are just going to proactively reach out for support if they're not doing okay. And we know that's not always the case. Unfortunately, I wish I didn't have to say this, but there is still stigma that occurs around this. And, people can sometimes worry if they reach out for help or identify that they're not okay during these transitions, that will, have an impact on their career or their reputation, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a big assumption. And that similar to what you were saying before, Di, that sometimes leaders think that it's always going to have a negative impact upon people transition. But we know just as much as transition brings challenge, it also brings incredible opportunity. And, this term work-life enrichment that is discussed in the white paper so beautifully is a great example of that. Work and life doesn't always need to be at loggerheads with one another. It's about flipping the coin. How does one role actually enhance, our other role? Like, I know for me personally, being a psychologist has made me a better mum, and being a mum has made me a much better psychologist. It doesn't always have to be like this. So they're my top five, and I will shush up now because I could talk all day.
I think that's brilliant, Sarah, and I just love the way you bring together that sort of professional experience as a psychologist with that practical lived experience. The one that really stood out for me there is the ask, don't assume. From a leader perspective, and this, I didn't quite understand what you meant by benevolent bias, but I think now, if I put that in a practical sense, if I had an employee, a staff member returning from parental leave, my benevolent bias would be to think, well, they're just back from parental leave, and whether it's paternity or maternity, don't sort of send them on interstate conferences or travel and that sort of thing. That would be me sort of trying to be kind and considerate. But what I'm hearing you say, that's a benevolent bias, and really that the approach should be to ask them. Yeah. And give them that, maintain that sort of locus of control, that job control, which we know, if done well, can be a really supportive thing. But if not, then it becomes, ends up becoming a sort of psychosocial hazard. So thank you for sharing that brilliant list of 5, and I've learnt some things from that as well. Let's explore then a little bit more the ripple effects that occur through when transitions aren't handled well, the impact on team, on the business, on customers, on performance. Di, what did the data from our research tell us about this?
Yeah, thanks, Darren. I'm mindful that we're running a little bit behind time, so I'm going to try and skip through this quite quickly. And of course, any impacts on mental health are associated with reductions in or weaknesses in work outcomes as well. And we see lower productivity and engagement. And then, of course, there's additional workload pressure across teams. And from there, it can snowball. So we need to be mindful of the potential ripple effects within organisations, such as, experiencing lower perceived fairness and less connectedness, and then we see lower retention and so on and so on. So it can get into a kind of a vicious cycle. But in the interest of getting on with the third theme, let's move on.
That sounds like a cue to me to move to theme 3, where we're expecting the kind of really meaty, most interesting stuff might be for our audience. And so, what does good look like? And it is always helpful if people. I mean, it's hard for people to be something if they can't see what good looks like. So, what can we do? What does good look like? And our white paper concluded with 4, essential sort of key actions. And I think we've got a visual here to frame that. We might bring that up now, I think, Di. So this is the insights from the paper, what employers can do.
Just skipping, there we go.
4 actions, and I'll just go through those quickly, and then we're going to unpack that for our audience. The first is laying solid foundations of support, and this is a real leadership opportunity. The second is understanding your workforce, knowing the demographics of the workforce that you're dealing with. Third, normalising the experience. Fourth, taking a holistic approach. So we're going to unpack these now with our expert panel members. And whilst Di and Sarah are sort of giving us some perspectives on these, I invite again the audience through the chat to pop in your thoughts on any actions or interventions that you know of in your workplace experience that have been implemented to address work-life transitions and where things have been done effectively. So I'm going to go across to you first, Di. What behaviours or skills do workplaces and leaders need to demonstrate in order to create a transition-aware workplace?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think it came through in the white paper as part of our 2 spotlighted transitions. And both of these spotlighted transitions show that management support and leadership are critical and can actually be protective of the negative mental health and work outcomes associated with these 2 transitions, personal family crises and planning for retirement. So improved awareness and capability of leaders and managers with respect to these transitions can really help to mitigate the negative impacts of the transitions, perhaps through things like modelling work-life balance, showing vulnerability as a leader, and encouraging those really positive help-seeking behaviours. Sarah, do you have any insights?
I agree with you wholeheartedly. The only thing I would add is the importance of what we call transitioning well, consistent leadership capability. You don't want to be relying on the boss lottery and just having the pressure of, oh, I was just lucky to have a boss that supported me through this or that. You want to have that consistent leadership capability. And one of the best ways you can build consistent leadership capability is to help your leaders be really good at conversations, compassionate, caring conversations, to be able to, rather than just having a good, flexible work arrangement policy in place, be able to actually translate that to the coalface. Like if someone comes to me and, shares with me that they've had a heartbreaking loss, how am I as a leader prepared to have that conversation? And so transitioning well, and I know I've given Mel a few links to share and she'll pop in the chat. There's some conversation simulations that we've built for supporting working parents that you can tap into. They're freely available, and also one on the family and domestic violence as well. If you've got a worker that comes to you, how do you as an employer support someone through that transition as well? So important, Darren, to build that consistent capability as under that first one.
Yeah, I'm hearing you say don't rely upon the boss lottery or make assumptions that our managers, supervisors, leaders have got the skills and the tools. We need to help provide them. We need to provide that sort of training and Thank you. There are some terrific resources that help, coach and guide managers through these, crucial conversations. I'm going to go to the second action, and this is about knowing your workforce, understanding the demographics. How can workplaces shift from responding or being reactive to transitions to preparing them, getting prepared in advance? Di, from a research data perspective, your thoughts?
Yeah, and this is also very critical. Being aware, I think, as in a management or leadership position, is the first step toward being more proactive and preventative in this space. And so what we're seeing in terms of help seeking, which I think is really useful, is that workers experiencing transitions, especially those with the highest levels of burnout, the highest levels of psychological distress, are actually seeking support, but they're doing so mainly through external sources of support and not through the workplace. So through family and friends, through a healthcare practitioner external to the workplace, or simply just taking time off work. So what we would like to see, of course, is that more employees turn to their managers and to counsellors through EAP type programs that are resources within the workplace. We know that workplaces are an underutilised form of support for mental health.
Yeah, look, and we know when work is good for people, it's terrific. But having the resources and tools, the capability to support people is so important. Sarah, I'm sure you have many insights, next instances of this, thinking about, how do organisations better understand their people, their population, the demographics.
Yeah, I think, Darren, it's interesting. It's so often talking to workplaces around this, they're not always across their demographics. And so I always encourage people to have a look at their data, because their data will just tell you so much about some of these trends, and to be able to, help them prevent and plan. And the only other note I would make, Darren, in the current psychosocial safety legislation too, is a lot of these transitions raise some red flags with psychosocial hazards as well. So for example, if you've got a high percentage of young workers in your workforce, for example, we know that things like psychosocial hazards around bullying and harassment, lack of reward and recognition, lack of support can be really high. So, by understanding your demographics, not only are you working out what supports they need, but also maybe what some of those psychosocial hazards that you might need to, shine a bit of a torch on as well in your organisation.
Yeah, no, for sure. Well, let's go straight into then how to normalise the experience, and let's talk about workplace culture and how it has the potential to influence, have a positive influence when people do feel safe to go and talk to their manager and raise their concerns or their issues. Di, what did the report tell us?
Yeah, so I guess feeling safe to initiate those conversations, and this is something that Sarah spoke to earlier, is really critical. So our two domains, leadership and capability, so two of our thriving workplace domains, are perhaps most relevant to creating that culture where employees feel safe to disclose. And so stronger leadership and capability scores, we often find through our data, are associated with improved mental health outcomes generally. And so what this looks like in practice is we're enhancing psychological safety through ensuring that our managers and leaders are capable and confident in initiating relevant and informed conversations, and making sure those conversations, of course, are approached with sensitivity and empathy.
Yeah.
Well, it sounds straightforward, doesn't it? Enhance leadership and capability, and you're going to create, a stronger culture, enhance psychological safety, and normalise the experience and people's preparedness to speak up at work. It sounds straightforward, but Sarah, if we go to action 4 and we think about, well, what does a holistic approach look like? And you sort of mentioned earlier, rather than seeing life and work kind of as opposite things or in conflict, if we want to bring them together, what does taking a holistic approach look like, and how can that benefit?
Yeah, I think it's really just moving towards more of that work-life enrichment. that we spoke about, and helping organisations and workers, really understand it from that perspective, Darren. I'm conscious of time, but I think if people are interested, the white paper just, talks about that so beautifully in that sort of towards the tail end of the white paper. It's got some great sort of literature there and some great tips, Darren, on how we can actually flip the coin a bit and actually change our thinking about these transitions and look at it more rather than work-life conflict, think of it more as, work-life enrichment.
Thank you. Now, we did want to give you the opportunity to showcase some of the headlines because Transitioning Well has learned a great deal through working with organisations, and I think you had some illustrations or exhibits you wanted to bring from the McCain's and Westpac example that might be helpful for people.
Yeah, but just really briefly, and I'm conscious of time, and if people need to leave, feel free. We are people of our word, so if you need to jump off, that's fine too. So just on page 12 of the white paper, you'll see a great case study by Westpac, and kudos to Westpac, because what they determined, Darren, when we talk about personal crises, is they realised that they wanted to provide their people with an additional level of support when they were going through probably one of the most heartbreaking experiences in their life, and that is fertility or pregnancy loss. And so what they did is, in addition to their EAP, they put in place specialised support, and we've been very proud to work with Westpac on that, where people can get that one-on-one support, leaders can get additional support to actually be able to walk by their side through that absolutely heartbreaking time. And then also McCain's on page 16 of the white paper outlined some great work that McCain's did. They identified that they had an ageing population, so rather than just sitting on their laurels, they went, nah, we're going to do something about this. We know that if we don't do something, the demographics are going to really, impact us in many ways. So they did a maturity of practice index with us where they understood how they could be ageing workforce ready, and they put in place some great interventions, leadership training. They did some one-on-one coaching with their people, who were thinking about retirement. They put in place some great succession planning, etc. So the white paper will give you some more detail on exactly what they did, but they're great, two really good examples, Darren, of leading organisations in this space.
Yeah, look, thanks, Sarah. And look, great advertisement for the fact that as organisations and as leaders, we don't have to just be affected by these transition events. There are definitely things that at an organisational perspective you can do around supporting your workforce. Now, I'm too conscious of time, and almost all of our participants have stuck with us, and I think they just want to hear. Let's go to the final one or two takeaways from today. Sarah, I think you've got one or two key takeaways that people are going to hear as they sort of sign off.
Right. So am I first?
Yeah, go. Yeah.
Know your people. Know your people, and ask, don't assume. Am I too?
Know your people. Ask, don't assume. Thank you, Di.
Really, I think target leadership and capability and use that transition-informed lens. It has a lot of potential to improve both outcomes from both employees and employers.
Super. Well, in what is a really, contemporary and relevant topic for us as leaders and employers today, I'm going to start to wrap it up. And I want to thank Dr. Sarah Cotton, Dr. Dianne Shepphard for their expertise, their wisdom and their insight sharing with us today. I'll call out to the audience, please check in the chat. Sarah and Di have done a terrific job of trying to encapsulate just some of the summary insights and headlines from the white paper. It's an excellent collaborative piece of work done between SuperFriend and Transitioning Well. It'll be dropped into the chat and distributed out to anyone who's signed up for the webinar today. So thoroughly commend the white paper to you. There's other resources that will be dropped in as well in terms of providing some of the frameworks and that Sarah referred to earlier, the 4 S's and so on. And let's just close with resources that anyone may want to or need to call upon in terms of personal support or support for their organisation. These are ones that you'll all be familiar with in terms of Lifeline, Beyond Blue, and so on. So on that note, super to have such a strong audience and great interest in this session. Super to have Sarah and Di's expertise and to be able to share with you today, and a really nice illustration of the power of collaboration, I think, between SuperFriend and Transitioning Well. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Darren.